Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. The next interview will be interesting because we what we saw in the Capitol on January 6th wasn't a surprise to researchers who have been looking at how disinformation works on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, right? And that includes the research team here at Rappler. But I think you've heard me say over and over that Facebook has now become a behavior modification system. The work of Shoshana Zuboff in her book that was published in 2019, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, she lays it out, and how the business model actually pushes this kind of behavior. What do we mean by behavior modification system? Well, it's the fact that on Facebook now, what spreads fastest are lies laced with anger and hate. Research shows that. Science magazine came out with that article in 2018 with that study, right? So um, lies, hate, uh, disinformation, conspiracy theories. All of these are seeded on social media. And then, whether or not you believe it, what winds up happening over time, and it's been 4 years that we've dealt with this in the Philippines, what happens over time is that you are then fed back uh, kind of triggers. And then how you react to those triggers, whether you click or you don't, whether you get angry or not, then gets fed back into the machine. So that becomes part of an ongoing experiment, right? We're part of this experiment when you're on social media, like Skinner behavior modification. That's where it comes from. Well, the woman that we're going to interview next is Kate Starbird. She is one of the first researchers I'd spoken with about this back in like 2016 or 2017. She is at the University of Washington. She's a professor at the Human Centered Design and Engineering, and she is the director of the Emerging Capacities of Mass Participation. I'm really thrilled to be able to talk to Kate Starbird, who has been doing this amazing work on disinformation for the last, I'd say, 4 years.
Yeah, we've been studying misinformation online for much longer. And at some point, what we studied turned from misinformation to disinformation, but we didn't quite recognize that until about 2016.
Right. Okay. Cool. So tell me your reaction to what happened on January 6th in the Capitol.
Yeah. As a researcher of disinformation, it was both like, to watch these things happen on television. I was watching television and social media, two feeds going at once. There was a sense of like, this is surreal. I can't believe this happening. At the same time, I'm just not even surprised. This is something that these characters, the people that are out there waving their flags and doing these things, we've seen their online personas, we've seen their rhetoric, we've seen what they said they were going to do, and here they're just doing what they said they were going to do. And so it wasn't so surprising, even as it was just surreal. Yeah.
And again, a lot of your research has been pointing these out, how they cluster together, how misinformation turns into disinformation, or how they conflate, and how it spreads, right? I guess, can you tell us how we got to this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of like retroactive trying to say exactly how things go, and we can't explain that all in a short conversation. But certainly part of it is there's these online networks of people that are coming together. There's certainly finding different configurations. So if you look at closely at what we saw yesterday and compare that to the social media data, you're seeing sort of pro-Trump activists. You're seeing QAnon conspiracy theory adherents, people that are already sort of very, very far down the rabbit hole. They're right-wing militias that are organized, that have been online, and they're beginning to connect. Those kinds of groups are beginning to connect online with other sort of white nationalists, Western chauvinists, other kinds of communities. So you've got these sort of like more broad, just sort of Trump supporters who are online being activists, becoming integrated into these communities that are more politically active and more focused on anti-government kinds of actions and things like that. And so they've been gathering online and connecting, and they've had this like constant, push of mis and disinformation, in some cases coming from the US president. They've been told that the election was stolen from him and therefore from them. that it was a landslide victory that was stolen by evil people. So they feel this sense of grievance. They're very bought into that sense of grievance. Um, they were online sharing the information that was claiming that there was all this voter fraud, and so they feel like they experienced it, even though there's no evidence to support it. And so they feel aggrieved, and they feel motivated to do something about it, even though that's all based on false conspiracy theories that are easily refuted, except if you're not able to see that because you're so just caught up in a media space that's telling you that this other reality is the real one.
I've started calling Facebook, because of the business model of the social media platforms, behavior modification systems. I mean, how far has it gone, and what role did these social media platforms play in this radicalization of these folks?
Yeah, I think if you focus on the last few months, you're not doing the right thing, right? We really have to look back over a long period of time to watch these networks grow, to watch people begin to be taken and pulled into these very separate realities, very separate feeds of what kinds of information is reaching them, and not just that, but the information that reaches them now is all wrapped up in a political wrapper that makes it very easily absorbed if it's your political wrapper, and very easy to just reject if it's not your political wrapper. And that's kind of how the systems have evolved. I'm not sure they were designed to do that, but that's how they evolved their recommendation algorithms, the things that they choose to show some people and not show other people. And then with Facebook groups, that's a place where people have figured out a way to come together in these very, sometimes publicly, but sometimes privately. They can organize there, they can share false information. And unfortunately, since the pandemic started, so many more people going online and being so disrupted and uncertain and impacted by the pandemic, we've seen people go to these groups and begin to connect between conspiracy theory communities and sort of more just sort of people concerned about the pandemic and our government response, and anti-vaccine communities and others. And we see these communities that seem so separate begin to come together, and then their numbers just started to really swell. So over the last 8 months or so, they just begun to grow and grow and manifest. And what we saw in Washington D.C. was only a small sliver of the larger population that's now many of them caught up in these information streams and really profoundly confused about what's happening in the world.
There's a lot of great work by academics now that show, for example, in YouTube algorithms, that when you go in, that it pushes you, if you look at a 9/11 conspiracy video, that it'll keep pushing you down the rabbit hole, right? That this kind of this changing of how we perceive the world. And then the other strand I was interested in is that these platforms look at data as all the same, equal. And I believe this is Shoshana Zuboff who said that, right? Like, since they are all equal, fact and fiction are identical. And if anything, lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further. Yesterday seemed like a natural, like you said, it's something it's not unexpected for people studying online. You've certainly said a lot of these. And then right after, yesterday, I was just retweeting you about how the same recidivist accounts are now blaming Antifa. Tell us a little bit more about that. And then I guess after the Antifa one, can you tell me about the impact on how, I think, on individual people when we're on these platforms?
Oh my gosh, there's so much there. I don't even know where to get started. But if you look at, what happened yesterday, there's this horrible event of unfolding. Most people are seeing it and saying, "Oh, this is not something I agree with. I don't agree with this. This is not something I like." But you'll already start to see the right-wing media sphere begin to try to reframe it in a way that won't be politically damaging to them. It's horribly politically damaging to these right-wing media outlets that have been spreading this content. They've been platforming the people that are selling these conspiracy theories to their audiences. And so they're beginning, they want to adapt to it. They want to figure out how to diminish the impact of this event on their reputation. And so they're trying out, oh, it's not really that big. Oh, it's not violent. They're trying out all these things. And of course, what we see is them try to very quickly blame this on not right-wing protesters, they're all, righteous and patriots, but somehow left-wing protesters must have infiltrated them and led all of these protesters astray. And certainly we might find all sorts of elements caught up in these protests that were part of it and trying to shape the protest in one direction or another. But the overwhelming force that shaped those protests was the right-wing rhetoric coming from the president himself to tell these people that they were aggrieved and that they needed to do something about it. And so, and you can just see that kind of misinformation and disinformation. It didn't start the last week or the last few months. They've been pumping out this stuff since August. And it's the president's account, it's the hyper-partisan media, but it's also Fox News pundits that bring these folks onto their shows and let them, spit out their conspiracy theories. And so, and their audiences have bought in, they're totally bought in. And yeah, I have a great empathy for the folks that have been pulled into these spaces. At the same time, I don't have a lot of tolerance anymore, right? Like, you have to be able to see this. And yet you could already see the right-wing media start to say, no, it's going to be okay. And if you're in these spaces and you believe these things now, and even as you're seeing these protests and you think, oh, I don't want that, that's violent, that's not what I believe in, your media ecosystem, your friends, your celebrity, people that you've come to know and care about who tell you these things every night between 7 and 10 p.m. on Fox News, they're telling you, no, it's okay. That's not what you saw. You saw something different. It's actually the other side that did it. So they're already trying to sort of, give their audience a different reality to help them absorb what just happened and help them reframe it. And so again, we're not seeing this coming together of realities. Even when we all saw this unfold together. We see the video, we can all go look at the video and the images. They're already sort of being reframed and we're being pulled again into these separate realities.
So I guess the next question I'm going to say is accountability, right? Yochai Benkler, like you just did, also puts a big chunk of the blame on media, right wing. So Fox News but at the same time, the seeding, the changing of the minds of people happens on social media. Facebook just banned Trump and Facebook and Instagram finally, right? Like after how many years
You've been asking for it for longer than anyone, right? You've been telling them that this is coming. Before Donald Trump was President Trump, you were one of the first to say that, yeah.
And this is what's horrifying about watching it, because it felt to me like Silicon Valley sins are home to roost, and here it is, and no one wants to see this happen, right? Wow. Whose fault, and how do we move forward, right? Like, because I guess part of it is, yes, bottom up, top down. President Trump, right, is being held accountable, but how do we move from here, Kate?
Yeah, no, I'm worried about it. I mean, we can talk a lot about, if you look back, for disinformation researchers, a lot of us thought, Donald Trump isn't the cause, he's a symptom. He's been, in some ways lifted by some of these dynamics. And the dynamics, and I know you've experienced this as you've talked about it in the context of Philippines, and I know we've been talking about it, is, it's not just the media. And I differ from Yochai a little bit here. I do think Fox News plays a huge role. I have family members who are been programmed by that channel over the last 15, 20 years. But it's not, when we look at actually what's going on, we have a complex media space, and social media have begun to play a bigger and bigger part of that. Certainly the Fox News pundits are inside of that. They're amplifiers. They are repeat offenders in the spread of misinformation online, and they also borrow things that they find online and bring them into their shows. What social media creates is this sort of, we call it participatory disinformation, where it gives, this opportunity to crowdsource what the latest conspiracy theory is going to be. And it can bubble up, and then it gets amplified by our celebrity leaders, Donald Trump in this case, but it happens elsewhere with others. And so there's this resonance between these top-down messages of, that are meant to sort of, guide and shape the audiences, but also the audiences who feel like they're part of it because their own messages could be retweeted by President Trump. That's so exciting. And so there's this kind of back and forth, which is, enabled by the way social media are designed. and it feeds into right now right-wing populism that's bubbling up all over the world. And it could, we could see left-wing populism as well. Right now we're seeing right-wing populism as the grievances and those who wish to use those grievances for power are able to get this instant feedback between what the latest grievance will be and how, oh, my leader thinks that too. And so there's this resonance that is happening there, and social media and the way they're designed and their policies and how they haven't really been willing to take action or even develop policies until very recently, but haven't been willing to take action on those policies is certainly how we got into this mess.
Europe has already started with legislation, and the U.S. with the Biden presidency. Again, because both sides, it's information is power, and I guess that's part of it, right? It's interesting now that in the final days of President Trump, Facebook bans him now. Uh, what role for legislation? What do you think would be constructive, and I guess in moving forward?
It's such a hard question, and I've been reluctant to answer it for the last few years, living in the U.S. and knowing who was in power, and really fearing how, if there was to be legislation, how that would work to feed the current power structures. And again, in some ways, it doesn't matter who's in charge. Although I do think that playing the sort of both sides, there's not symmetry right now in who's using and taking advantage of these tools in ways that are harmful. But certainly there's the potential for that to happen on both sides of the political spectrum. So I've been really reluctant to answer that question. I think over the next few months, I may be less reluctant to start thinking about what does my, productive, careful, and thoughtful legislation look like, or policy look like, to help guide these platforms. But I think we have to revisit the whole business model that's broken at the core. And Zuboff gets into that in her wonderful book. It's like, these platforms they're made to sort of control us eventually, right? To learn about us and to shape our behaviors in order to feed, in her case, they're feeding industry and the money making, but also they can be co-opted into feeding sort of political movements as well. And so unless we can rethink that model where it's based on us seeing these advertisements, I don't know what we're going to be able to create something that's better. And also, it's one of the things I think is a confounder is we're not starting from nothing. We're starting from where we are right now. The networks are dense and they're connected and they're wired for disinformation now. Everybody's following everybody, and the way it's developed, everyone's wearing their political armbands, and so you can see who the other side is, and so you automatically know who to accept and who to reject, and the recommendations. So the structure is already there. So we're not starting from scratch where we could have taken this to a different direction. We're starting from a very toxic social media environment. And so what we might recommend for starting from scratch, we don't have that. And so some of the actions I've seen the social media companies take recently have been, that would have been great 10 years ago, but it's too late.
That's exactly, that's the same reaction. It's like, oh my gosh. And then I guess the other part is that people have been fundamentally changed by this, right? And I went back over the holidays and rewatched The Matrix. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, the context for that movie has drastically changed. A lot of people think that, with America, with the Biden presidency, will be better. Maybe, yes, right, in terms of values, standing up for values of American values. But what about the people who have been changed by the information, the behavior modification, the information that have been clustered into these things? How do you see oh my gosh, how do you heal these divisions?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, just think about it from the COVID context about the pandemic. Does anyone think that having a Biden presidency is going to make more people on the right want to take the vaccine or wear masks? I can't fathom that realm of possibilities. And so much of their behaviors are shaped by misinformation and politicized misinformation, disinformation that they've been seeing over the last few months. And so while I think the United States, if you're looking at from the outside in, may look more secure with a Biden presidency and some of the things that are happening with our Senate races, which I think will at least let Biden actually take some actions. I think that'll be productive early on. I don't think a Biden presidency fixes the toxicity of all of the people that are already swimming in this disinformation. And in fact, it's going to make them more aggrieved, more susceptible to people who might want to manipulate that grievance for their political power. President Trump turned out to be really good at using social media and using these new kind of media environments for political power. Will he be replaced by someone else who's also good, but something? So I'm worried about that scenario, and I'm also worried about him setting up a sort of a separate sort of pole of what does it mean to be, you know, an American right now, and continue to kind of have that relationship with an aggrieved audience. I mean, these people protest while he's still president. Imagine what's going to happen when he's gone. I don't see a Biden presidency solving the problem. I think something else is going to have to change in terms of the media environment, social media environment, and ourselves.
So the last question I have is about the impact in the rest of the world. I I have been jumping up and down for 4 years because we feel it, right? Yeah. I mean, we're living. You still have institutions that didn't collapse. It's funny because the way when I saw it, it was like this is all the stuff on social media, but then you also had a president who took actions in the real world that like termites that eroded the institutions in plain sight. Well, here our institutions collapsed, and it's probably part of the reason I have to look at maybe going to jail. What do you see for the rest of the world?
No, it's I mean, it's a scary time, and it's I think the awareness of how vulnerable our institutions were in the United States gave a lot of us a new kind of perspective on this is no country is impervious, and certainly these new technologies, these new information technologies have disrupted things in ways. Oh, they're disruptors, great, until they've really disrupted a lot of, especially emerging democracies or democracies that were just just becoming strong. I think we're extra vulnerable. But even even something that's been around for 200 years is vulnerable right now. And you said that the institutions hold. Well, we felt them kind of slipping away. And the margin of victory for President-elect Biden is pretty thin. It was pretty close. And I think 4 more years there wouldn't be much left. And there's no telling what happens in the next, in 4 years after this either. So I think a lot of us are feeling vulnerable right now, but also have a lot of empathy, and probably, unfortunately, it took this to be as aware, but more empathy for other folks who are experiencing this in other parts of the world, for sure.
I said the last question, but this really is the last one. And any advice for Filipinos? Facebook really is our internet. 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook, and we're connected. Any advice for people who use social media?
It's been hard. It's so hard to tell people not to use it, right? I don't not use it. I use social media all the time. To be a little bit more mindful about my use, absolutely. To understand that when I get emotional and excited, I'm vulnerable to spreading, misinformation that aligns with my views. And each time I do that, I erode people's sense of trust in me, but of trust in the institutions that I care about. So I try to be much more careful now that I understand the problem. Much more slow to participate in emergent events, and really try to get a sense of what's going on before I add my voice into the noise. But Um, it's one of the things we've told people is to just tune into our emotions, because that's where we're most likely to be manipulated. And so we have this idea that if we're just smarter, just think harder, or use these 3 heuristics, you're going to be better at understanding how to interact online. But really, that's not where we get manipulated. It's in our emotions. It's when they make us angry or outraged or feel grievance or feel like something's stolen from us. That's when we're most vulnerable to being manipulated. And to understand that, it may feel good in the moment, but we're becoming a pawn in somebody else's game, and in the long term, that can really undermine the things we care about. Um, and just to take responsibility. Another thing we've seen is that people think that social media is so big and my voice doesn't really matter, but it does, and your voice does matter. So not only don't spread it, but if you do spread misinformation, to correct yourself, and also to learn how to, with empathy and understanding, to correct each other and try to hold each other to a higher standard, and really kind of take responsibility. We have all this power now. We're all citizen reporters, but with that power comes responsibility, and we need to kind of maybe step up and take a little bit more responsibility with how we interact online. But unfortunately, I think even following all of that doesn't solve some of the problems of manipulation and other things. And I really do think the platforms have to step up, and we need to see some other kinds of efforts to help fix some of these toxicities that we're all experiencing.
Fantastic. And well, I mean, not fantastic that, but a great summary of what we can do, and of course, so much to do moving forward. We didn't touch on the evolution of geopolitical power. We have to. I mean, from what you have seen, what role Russian again, on our end, we've seen Russian disinformation, Chinese disinformation. The most recent takedown of Facebook, September 22, in the Philippines, took down Chinese influence operations that were not just targeting the Philippines, so we're not just attacking me. But we're also targeting American elections. This was September 22. So, what role do you see that playing, and how did it fit into what happened in the United States?
Yeah, information operations are going to continue to be a place where foreign entities, but also or governments are going to try to play in those spaces and manipulate people for their ends. But we're also seeing sort of corporations, industries, other kinds of networks of power are going to continue to try to use these platforms, these tools, and the vulnerabilities that we have as people in these spaces. They're going to try to exploit those for their gain. And we're seeing it, Russia, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, are probably the United States on these other scales. And then internally, we're experiencing these from domestic actors in a lot of countries. And so what does it mean for us to, how is that going to continue to evolve? With the 2020 election in the United States, really, if we look at, where the most disinformation was coming from, certainly we saw Russia trying to participate. Certainly we saw Iran trying to participate. But most of the disinformation was really coming from domestic accounts. And if we compare to 2016, we saw a lot of inauthentic behavior, trolls, people fake personas, that were coordinated from St. Petersburg. And in 2020, that's not what we saw. We saw, blue check accounts. They were, they were authentic. They were people who said who they were, just spreading disinformation that was, helping their preferred political candidate. In some cases, it was President Trump himself spreading this disinformation. So a very interesting shift from 2016 to 2020, in part because the platforms went and they tried to root out the inauthentic behavior, but they didn't do anything about the blue check accounts, the verified accounts. And so we're seeing them today take that action. It's interesting to see them always, solve the last problem, but certainly misinformation, disinformation information operations are all going to continue to evolve and continue to be used by all sorts of entities, and something that we all need to be aware of as we're interacting in these online spaces, that we're targeted there and we're vulnerable there.
Fantastic. Kate Starbird, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was great talking with you.
That was Kate Starbird from the University of Washington. She's the director of the emerging capacities of mass participation. She's one of the people I wind up talking to a lot about what we're calling emergent behavior, right? Which is, how do we as a group when we're all pulled together, how do we act? And how does that change our actions? Well, we're seeing it play out now. Um, it's not going to go away, as you heard from Kate. And I think in the Philippines, we take it a step further because we're actually further along than the United States. What we saw on January 6th is our Silicon Valley sins coming home to roost. But here in the Philippines, we live with this every day, every second. Be aware, be careful, be aware that you could be manipulated, and be careful of spreading your emotions, anger in particular. I'm Maria Ressa. Thank you for joining us.